The first scream cut through the desert air like the hiss of a rattler, sharp enough to stop a man's breath. It echoed across the sun-baked plains, bouncing off jagged cliffs and dry gulches, until it sounded less like a woman's cry and more like the ghost of the land, itself crying out for mercy. By the time the townsfolk raised their heads from their chores, farmers halting mid-swing with their hoes, blacksmiths pausing with hammers mid-strike, children silenced in their games of marbles, and tag, the sight that greeted them twisted their guts cold. Out beyond the edge of town, where the long steel rails carved a silver scar through red earth, a young woman of 30 lay shackled to the very heart of that iron track. Her arms were stretched outward, wrists pinned by thick rusted chains that clung to the metal like a cruel embrace. The hot sun reflected on her pale skin, and sweat pooled in the hollow of her neck as she writhed against the weight of the restraints. Dust rose with her every desperate kick, and the sound of those chains scraping on iron became a grim music of futility. From afar, it might have looked like some staged punishment, like the old stories whispered in saloons of outlaws tying women to tracks for cruel revenge, but this was no tale. The faint tremor beneath the ground told the truth. A train was coming, and it wasn't far. The air itself carried dread. First came the faint groan of wheels on rails, distant but steady, like the growl of a predator circling. Then, seconds later, the whistle split the stillness, shrill and merciless. Every man, woman, and child who heard it felt the same chill crawl along their spine. Who could have done such a thing? Why leave her to such a death? The desert, in its silence, gave no answer, but there was another pair of eyes watching. Behind a ridge of red sandstone that towered like the ruins of some ancient fortress, a figure crouched in the shadows. His chest was bare, bronzed by sun and wind, muscles carved by years of labor and survival. His long black hair, bound with strips of leather, caught the desert breeze. Around his neck and wrists hung tribal jewelry, bone beads, bits of silver tokens of his people. His eyes, sharp and unyielding as flint, fixed on the woman in peril. This was no ordinary man. He was a warrior, one whose presence the townsfolk whispered about with equal parts fear and fascination. Some said he carried the blood of the old tribes who had hunted these lands before the first railroad split them apart. Others swore he was cursed, a shadow walker who appeared where death loomed, as though fate itself called him. But what he carried more than myth was an oath, spoken long ago at the graveside of kin he could not save. Never again would another soul be taken unjustly if he still drew breath. He could see the desperation in her movements, the way her voice cracked against the empty sky, the helplessness in her eyes. He could also feel the rumble beneath the earth, growing stronger, vibrating up through his moccasins. Each passing heartbeat was another tick in the countdown to tragedy. His grip tightened on the ashwood spear in his hand. The weapon was old, scarred, the metal tip weathered, yet still sharp enough to split bone. He had carried it through hunts, battles, and storms, but never had it felt heavier than it did now. The black smoke of the train rose faintly against the horizon, curling into the blue sky like a serpent uncoiling. The whistle shrieked again, closer this time, carrying with it a finality that made his heart hammer in his chest. He breathed once, deeply, filling his lungs with the sharp scent of desert sage and hot iron. The choice was not really a choice. He knew his path. In one swift motion, the warrior sprang from the ridge, his moccasins pounding against the hard-packed earth. Each stride kicked up dust that followed him like a storm cloud. His shadow stretched long across the sunlit ground, racing him toward the bound woman. The chains rattled as she lifted her head, eyes widening at the sight of the figure bearing down on her. To her, he must have seemed like an apparition, shirtless, fierce, untamed, rising out of the very earth itself. She gasped, torn between fear of this wild stranger and hope that he might be her salvation. The train's scream tore through the Kia Ovdi Haldian valley again, louder, heavier, its massive body bearing down like a black beast of iron and smoke. And still the warrior ran. The sun blazed overhead like a cruel overseer, pouring heat down upon the woman's trembling body. Her lips cracked with dryness, her throat raw from screaming, and still she fought against the rusted shackles that bit into her skin. Each tug only tore flesh deeper, leaving dark smears of blood on the iron rail. Her heart thundered as the sound of the train grew clearer, a steady metallic chant that filled the valley with dread. The whistle blew again, long, shrill, and merciless. It was not a sound meant for her. It was meant for the cattlemen, the freight handlers, the folk awaiting goods in the towns beyond. Yet in her ears it was a funeral bell. The earth itself began to vibrate now, a low hum that rattled through her bones. Tiny stones trembled along the track, shifting with each pulse of approaching doom. Her eyes blurred with tears and the desert. Sky above her spun blue vastness cut by streaks of black. Smoke rising on the horizon. She thought of the men who had dragged her here, their coarse laughter echoing in her memory. Rough hands had yanked her by the arms, boots kicking at her legs as she screamed. "No one will hear you," one of them had spat, fastening the chain around her wrists. Another had pressed the iron lock shut with a cruel grin. And then they'd left her, their silhouettes fading against the sunlit ridge, leaving her to the mercy of steel and fire. How quickly hope had bled from her then. She had prayed with lips trembling, begged God to let her live, to send her some miracle in this God-forsaken desert. But prayers felt small when the only answer was the shriek of a whistle and the shadow of death growing closer. She turned, her face against the hot iron, trying to will herself numb. When movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was heat playing tricks, one of those cruel mirages that shimmered across the plains. But no, the figure was real. A man. He ran with the force of a storm, muscles rippling under bronze skin, long black hair streaming behind him. Dust billowed with each step as though the desert itself bowed to his urgency. She could hardly comprehend him. His bare chest gleamed, with sweat tribal ornaments catching the sunlight. His very presence was fierce, otherworldly, like some spirit torn from the old stories of this land. She felt her breath catch in her throat. Fear mingled with hope, a paradox that left her. Heart pounding even harder than before. Could he possibly reach her in time? The train screamed again, louder, so loud it rattled her teeth. She could see its black body now, the great locomotive pounding forward, its iron wheels sparking against the rails. Smoke rolled from its chimney in choking plumes. Stretching skyward like an omen. She whimpered, tugging helplessly at the chains. Her wrists burned raw, the cuffs slicing deeper. The vibrations of the ground grew so strong that her body shook against the iron track. The world narrowed to two sounds, the relentless roar of the train and the rhythmic pounding of the warrior's footsteps as he closed the distance, and then he was there, dropping to his knees beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the chains. He didn't speak at first, only gripped the shackles with hands calloused from a lifetime of struggle. The metal resisted, unmoved by sheer willpower. The woman gasped, choking back sobs, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. "Please, it's coming." The warrior glanced up for the briefest moment. The train loomed, monstrous and unstoppable, its massive iron body charging toward them like a beast with no thought but destruction. Steam hissed from its sides, white plumes against the desert sky. It bore down, closing the gap with terrifying speed. His jaw tightened. The veins in his arms bulged as he wrenched at the lock again, muscles straining against steel. The chain cut into his palms, drawing blood, but he did not release it. The woman felt her breath shudder. This man was not like the others. Where they had laughed at her helplessness, he carried her fear as though it were his own burden. The ground trembled. Harder. The sound was deafening now, iron wheels shrieking, rails groaning, the whistle piercing like a scream from hell itself. The woman squeezed her eyes shut, whispering one last broken prayer. And then, above the roar, came the warrior's own voice, low, fierce, certain. "You will not die here." With that, he shifted, slamming the butt of his spear against the bolt that bound her. Sparks flew. The metal shrieked. The lock rattled, cracked, and held for now. The train was nearly upon them. The ground quaked beneath them as though the desert itself feared what was coming. Each second carried the thunder of wheels rolling closer, a monstrous drumbeat that shook the rails and pounded into the woman's chest. She gasped, eyes wide, throat raw from screaming, unable to move as the heat of the steel track burned her skin. The warrior knelt beside her, shoulders broad, his body glistening with sweat. His chest rose and fell in heavy breaths as he fought with the chain. His hands, roughened by years of survival, yanked with the fury of a man pulling against fate itself. But the rusted shackles refused to break. Her gaze locked on his face. There was no fear there. His jaw was set, eyes fierce, dark hair wild in the hot wind. He looked carved from the very stone of the desert, an immovable force against time. For one moment, despite the shriek of the train bearing down upon them, she felt a flicker of something strange. Safety. The whistle blasted again, closer, deafening. She craned her neck and saw at the engine, black and massive, barreling down the line with smoke trailing like the tail of a dragon. The iron beast devoured the ground, wheels sparking fire against steel. It was no longer a sound or a shadow. It was there, charging toward them, unstoppable. The warrior ripped again at the chains, muscles swelling, veins rising in his arms. The lock refused him, clanging back against the spear point. He bared his teeth in a growl, the sound guttural, primal, as though he might wrestle the very train itself if he had to. "Go!" she cried, her voice broken by panic. "You can't. There's no time." But his eyes snapped to hers, fierce and unyielding. "You will not die here." The certainty in his tone stole her breath. He believed it utterly, fully, with the weight of his soul. And for the first time since she had been chained, a flicker of faith sparked inside her chest. He slammed the spear again. Sparks burst. The bolt groaned. The sound of tearing iron mingled with the scream of the train until she could no longer tell which was which. The ground shook violently now. Dust jumped from the rails. The train was so near she could see the rivets in its sides. The sweat on the brow of the engineer leaning forward, his eyes wide in horror at the sight before him. She heard the squeal of brakes, but the beast was too heavy, too fast. "Please," she whispered. Tears streaming down her cheeks. The warrior shifted, planting his knees, wrapping both hands around the lock. Blood smeared his palms, dripping from cuts, but his grip only tightened. With a roar, he wrenched the spear downward, metal shrieking in protest. Then dash clang. The bolt cracked, splitting with a sharp ring. One cuff burst free, the chain falling. Loose. For a heartbeat she could not believe it. Her hand lifted, trembling, no longer bound. But the other wrist was still shackled tight. The train was almost upon them now, its shadow swallowing the ground, its iron wheels a blur of death. The warrior moved faster than thought. He seized the chain, wrapping it around his fist, and with a savage pull tore the cuff hard against the spearhead. Sparks exploded. The steel screamed. The woman's world shrank to a single instant. The warrior's face twisted in exertion. The crack of breaking iron, the heat of his body beside hers, and the deafening roar of the train screaming into their space. With a final wrench, the shackle gave. The warrior grabbed her, hauling her upward in one sweeping motion. She stumbled into his arms, the broken chains clattering uselessly at her wrists. He turned, dragging her from the rail just as the locomotive thundered past, its monstrous body so close the wind tore at their hair and clothing. The blast of air struck like a fist, throwing them both backward into the dirt. The ground trembled. As car after car screamed by, sparks flying, iron shrieking in a fury of unstoppable momentum. Dust billowed, choking the air, stinging eyes and skin. She clutched at him, burying her face in his chest, sobbing against the steady drum of his heartbeat. Her body shook, every nerve alive with the memory of death's breath. Yet she was alive because of him. The warrior held her tightly, shielding her from the storm of wind and grit as the train roared on. His chest rose and fell against her cheek, strong and steady. His eyes never left the horizon, as though watching not the train, but the hand of fate itself retreat. When at last the caboose rattled past and silence began to fall again over the valley, she dared to lift her face. He looked down at her, eyes still fierce, though softer now, carrying a weight she couldn't name. "You're safe," he said simply, voice low, resonant. The words struck her harder than any gunshot because she realized they were true. For the first time since the chains had closed around her wrists, she believed she might yet live. But before relief could settle fully into her bones, she noticed his gaze shift not at her, not at the departing train, but back toward the ridge. Her. Stomach dropped. Dark figures moved there, stepping out of the shimmering heat men with rifles glinting in the sun. The ones who had chained her. And they were coming back. The last echo of the train's thunder had barely faded when silence settled, heavy and uneasy. The woman's sobs hung in the dry air, broken only by the clatter of the broken chains still dangling from her wrists. She pressed herself into the pafag warrior's chest, trembling, clinging to the warmth of his body as if it alone anchored her to life. For a fleeting instant, she thought it was over, that she had cheated death, that God had sent her this stranger to pull her from the jaws of iron. But the warrior's eyes were not on her. His gaze fixed on the ridge, where shadows had begun to move, shadows that walked like men. She turned, dread crawling up her spine. Figures emerged from the shimmering heat of the desert. 5 of them, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung across broad shoulders. Dust clung to their hats, their mouths twisted into cruel smirks. They strolled down the slope with the arrogance of men who believe themselves untouchable. The sun at their backs, their eyes glinting like rattlesnakes. "Well now," one of them drawled, his voice thick with mockery, "ain't this a sight? The wild savage pulled our little bird right off the rail." The woman's heart clenched. These were the same men who had bound her here. She recognized their laughter, the sneer in their voices. She stumbled backward, clutching the warrior's arm. Another outlaw spat into the dirt. "Could have let the train do our work, but no, he had to play hero." His gaze swept the warrior from head to toe, lingering on the sweat-slick muscles, the tribal beads hanging from his chest. "Ain't that just like one of his kind? Meddling where he don't belong." The warrior said nothing. He rose to his full height, stepping in front of the woman, his body a wall between her and the rifles. His chest rose and fell, steady, controlled, though his eyes burned like coals about to erupt into flame. He gripped his spear tighter, its sharp head catching the sunlight. The leader smirked, lifting his rifle lazily. "Step aside, Redskin. We only came for the lady. Let us finish what we started, and maybe we'll leave your hide in one piece." The woman's voice broke as she cried out, "No! Please don't let them." The warrior didn't glance back at her. His voice, when it came, was deep, resonant, carrying the weight of stone and thunder. "You chained her to die like an animal. Now you face me." The outlaws erupted in laughter, their cruel mirth echoing across the desert. One cocked his rifle, aiming low. "Hear that, boys? He thinks he's standing against us." The first shot cracked, a thunderclap that sent dust flying near the warrior's feet. The woman screamed and ducked, clutching her wrists, but the warrior did not flinch. His eyes narrowed, his body shifting like a predator ready to strike. The outlaws saw, too, the stillness before a storm, the coiled spring of danger in every line of his frame. Their laughter faltered, unease threading through the bravado. Then the warrior moved. He lunged forward with speed so fierce it blurred against the sun. His spear swept in a wide arc, striking the rifle of the nearest man. The weapon clattered to the ground, and the outlaw cried out as the spear shaft slammed across his chest, sending him sprawling into the dust. The others raised their rifles in panic. Shots cracked, bullets whining through the air, but the warrior was already in motion. He ducked low, rolling across the gravel, kicking one man's legs out from under him. The outlaw fell hard, his rifle firing harmlessly into the sky. The woman, hard hammering, saw a rifle drop close to her feet. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the cold metal. She had never held a gun in her life, but desperation guided her grip. Smoke filled her nostrils as another shot rang out, this one hers. The bullet tore past an outlaw's shoulder, grazing him enough to drop him to his knees with a howl. The warrior glanced at her only for an instant, a flicker of approval in his eyes, before driving his spear into the ground to block another strike. He ripped the weapon free, spinning with lethal precision, and struck the butt of it across another outlaw's jaw. Bone cracked. The man collapsed, groaning in the dirt. Dust and gunpowder thickened the air. The woman coughed, eyes stinging. But she did not let go of the rifle. She had tasted helplessness on the rails. She would not taste it again. One outlaw remained standing, his rifle trained directly on the warrior's chest. The click of the hammer pulled back cut through the chaos like a death knell. "Not so fast, savage," the man hissed. "You're done." The woman's breath caught. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but her hand shook too hard. The warrior stood still, staring down the barrel, his chest rising and falling slow as if daring the outlaw to pull. For a moment, the desert froze in silence. The world seemed to stop breathing. The outlaw's rifle leveled square at the warrior's chest, the long black barrel gleaming in the afternoon sun. Dust floated lazily in the air between them, glowing like embers in the harsh light. The woman clutched the rifle she had picked up, her hand shaking, her finger hovering near the trigger but frozen by terror. The outlaw's grin spread, crooked and cruel. Sweat trickled down his temples, though he held his aim steady. "Looks like your luck's run out, savage," he spat. "You might have fooled the lady, but no man stands against a bullet." The warrior stood still, his chest rising and falling, muscles coiled yet calm. His eyes dark, steady, unflinching bore into the outlaws, not with fear, but with something deeper, defiance. He did not cower, did not beg. His silence spoke louder than any plea. The woman's breath came in quick bursts. Her knees wobbled, her whole body begging her to run, to hide. But her heart screamed louder, "Don't let him die. Not after he saved you." She remembered the roar of the train, the pull of his arms, the promise in his voice. "You will not die." Here, could she allow him to fall now after such courage? The outlaw's finger tightened on the trigger, and then the warrior moved. It was so fast the woman nearly missed it. One heartbeat he was still, the next he lunged, twisting sideways. As the outlaw fired, the bullet screamed past, searing the air, missing his chest by inches. In that same instant, the warrior's spear swept upward in a blur of wood and steel. The outlaw's rifle clattered from his hands as the spear's shaft smashed into his wrist. He howled, clutching the wound, stumbling back. The warrior pressed forward, striking with the other end of the spear, driving it into the outlaw's gut. The man collapsed onto his knees, coughing, the wind knocked out of him. But the fight was not over. Another outlaw, the one she had grazed with her trembling, Shot rose to his feet behind the warrior, blood streaming down his arm, fury twisting his face. He lifted his revolver with his good hand, aiming at the warrior's back. The woman saw it before anyone else. For one terrifying moment, she froze, caught between fear and action. Then, something inside her broke free the helplessness, the humiliation of being chained, the memory of their laughter as they left her to die. Rage surged through her veins, burning away hesitation. Her finger clenched the trigger. The revolver bucked in her hands. The shot rang out across the desert. The outlaw staggered, his revolver tumbling from his grasp, his eyes wide with shock. He swayed once before falling hard into the dust, groaning before stillness claimed him. The rifle shook in her grip, smoke curling from the barrel. Her ears rang from the blast, but her eyes stayed locked on the man she had just stopped. Her whole body trembled, yet in her chest burned something she hadn't felt before. Power. The warrior turned, his gaze landing on her. For an instant their eyes locked. Hers were wide with shock, his filled with something like respect. He gave a single nod, the barest acknowledgment, but one that spoke volumes. The remaining outlaws, groaning and battered in the dirt, began to crawl away. The leader, the one who had threatened the warrior at gunpoint, spat blood and glared up at him. "You'll pay for this," he rasped. "Ain't no town gonna thank you for meddling. They'll turn on you same as us." The warrior leaned down, his shadow falling over the man like a thundercloud. His voice rumbled low, dangerous. "Better pray the desert swallows you before you cross my path again." The outlaw's smirk faltered. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist, and staggered away with the others, retreating into the heat haze until they vanished beyond the ridge. Silence returned, broken only by the woman's ragged breaths. Her grip loosened, the rifle dropping from her hands into the dirt. She swayed, exhaustion overtaking her, until the warrior's arm caught her. He steadied her with ease, his chest solid, his presence grounding her shaking body. Her voice came, soft, trembling. "Why? Why would you save me? You didn't even know me." The warrior looked down at her, his eyes unreadable, his words slow and measured. "Because no one deserves chains." The simple truth of it sank into her bones, deeper than any sermon she'd ever heard. She studied his face, scarred, stern, yet somehow gentle in this moment. He was unlike any man she had known, untamed, fierce, bound not by law or greed, but by a code older than the railroad itself. For a moment, she wanted to speak again, to thank him, to ask his name. But before she could, the sound of hooves drifted on the wind. The warrior's head snapped up, his body stiffening. The woman's heart skipped. Had the outlaws returned with reinforcements? The sound grew louder. Many riders, the rhythmic pounding of horses across hard earth. Dust rose in a long plume on the horizon. The woman clutched his arm, fear flooding her anew. "They're coming back." But the warrior's eyes narrowed, watching the line of riders crest the ridge. His grip tightened on his spear. This was not finished. The night after the rescue, the town of Dry Creek was still restless. People spoke in hushed tones around saloon tables, and the tapping of boots on wooden floors carried unease. Lantern light flickered against warped glass, and in every corner whispers swirled. Why was she on the track? Who bound her? Was it meant for her or the warrior man who saved her? The young lady, though safe, had not spoken of what truly happened. She stayed in a small room above the inn, its window facing the dark silhouette of the railway. Shadows of passing clouds swept across her face as she sat awake, trembling. She could still feel the weight of the iron chains, the vibration of the ground beneath her as the train roared closer, and the impossible strength of the warrior's hands as he tore her free. Downstairs, the warrior man sat by the hearth. Shirtless, his chest scarred with stories of battles past, his long black hair falling across his shoulders, he stared into the fire without blinking. A pipe lay forgotten in his hand. Though the townsfolk avoided his gaze, they all felt the same question burning. Who would do such a thing, and why? Sheriff Dobbs finally broke the silence. He leaned against the counter, his voice low. Tracks don't whisper unless there's trouble near. Someone wanted her gone, and it wasn't no accident. His weathered face twisted as though the truth weighed heavy on him. This ain't just about one woman. It's about the whole town. The warrior lifted his head slowly, his dark eyes catching the firelight. He spoke in a voice deep and steady, like thunder rolling across distant mountains. She was not meant to die by chance. Chains were set with hands. I saw the marks, the knots. Whoever did it watched from the hills. A murmur rippled through the room. Men shifted in their chairs, wives clutched shawls tighter. The idea that a pair of eyes had been watching, waiting for the train to strike, sent a shiver through every spine. The lady appeared at the top of the stairs then, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but her chin lifted with defiance. Every gaze turned. To her, silence gripping the room. She stepped slowly down, each wooden stair creaking under her small boots. When she reached the bottom, she looked directly at the warrior. "They'll come again," she whispered. The room stiffened. She swallowed hard and continued, her voice trembling. "It wasn't chance. I was meant to be an example. To silence me. To remind this town of its fear." Her eyes darted toward the sheriff. "You know who I mean." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The warrior rose from his chair, towering like a shadow come to life. He stepped toward her, his presence filling the room. "Speak truth. Who bound you?" Tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She clutched the shawl tighter, shaking her head. "If I speak, more blood will spill. They won't stop at me. They'll burn this town to ash if they have to." The warrior's gaze softened, though his voice remained stern. "Silence feeds wolves. Truth breaks them." The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the silence. At last, she whispered a name low, almost inaudible, but enough to send the sheriff's glass clattering against the counter. Murmurs exploded through the room, and the warrior's eyes narrowed. That name was not a stranger's. It was a man. Known in town, a man with power. A man whose smile had always hidden something darker. The warrior turned toward the door, muscles taut, his shadow long across the floorboards. He said only one thing before stepping into the cold night. "The tracks will whisper again. But this time, I will be waiting." Outside, the wind howled through the empty street, rattling shutters and tossing dust across the silent rails. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. And in that cry, the town of Dry Creek felt a promise that before this was over, blood would stain the ground. The following dawn, Dry Creek awoke to a silence heavier than any storm. Clouds pressed low over the land, and the railroad gleamed cold under the dim light. People gathered near the station, drawn by fear and curiosity, for word had spread someone had bound the lady to the tracks, and the warrior man had vowed to wait there for the ones who would strike again. The warrior stood alone at the edge of the railway. His bare chest bore the marks of battles long past, his long black hair shifting in the bitter wind. Around his neck hung tribal jewelry, small talismans of strength. His eyes never left the horizon dot behind him. The lady approached, wrapped in her shawl. She stood tall despite the tremor in her hands. The townsfolk whispered when they saw her, some urging her to go back inside, others clutching at their children's shoulders. But she would not hide. Her voice had been nearly silenced once, and she would not let fear chain her again. Sheriff Dobbs arrived last, his badge catching the pale light. He looked weary, as though the truth she had whispered the night before had aged him 10 years. In a single night. The sheriff kept his hand near his gun, but his eyes avoided hers. He knew the name she had spoken. He had known it for years. From the ridge above town, hooves thundered. Dust rose in a storm, and soon riders appeared, 5 men, faces hidden beneath wide hats, guns at their sides. They rode with the confidence of men who believe no law touched them. At their head rode Marcus Hawley, the wealthy cattle baron whose reach stretched across the county. The lady's voice quivered, but she spoke loud enough for all to hear. "That's him. He gave the order." Gasps spread through the crowd. Some nodded grimly. Others muttered in disbelief. Hawley had built much of Dry Creek, but he had also crushed anyone who stood against him. Now it was clear he had meant to silence her, for she had spoken of his debts, his cruelty, and his claim to land not his own. The warrior stepped forward, his voice steady as stone. "You set chains on her. You watched as iron sang with death. You thought her spirit weak. You were wrong." Hawley laughed, a cruel sound that echoed down the tracks. "This town eats from my hand. No one crosses me." She forgot her place, and "You," he pointed a gloved hand at the warrior, "you don't belong here. You should have let her die." The warrior's muscles tightened, but his eyes remained calm. He raised his hand, palm open to the sky. "These tracks whisper. They carry stories of those who pass and those who fall. Today they will remember justice." The riders reached for their guns. Townsfolk screamed, scattering behind barrels and wagons. But the warrior moved like lightning. His body was a storm rolling, unyielding. He leapt, seized one rider's arm, and pulled him clean off his horse, sending him crashing into the dust. A second fired, but the warrior twisted, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He roared, grabbed the man's wrist, and snapped it with a sickening crack. The crowd could only watch in awe. The warrior fought not as a man, but as something larger, an ancient force, honed by survival, by pain, by spirit. His fists struck with the power of thunder, his movements fluid like water. Horses reared, men cried out, guns clattered against. Stoned out at last, only Hawley remained in the saddle, his face pale beneath his hat. He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, the warrior was upon him. With one hand, he wrenched the gun away. With the other, he dragged Hawley from his horse and slammed him to the ground, pinning him with a knee. The lady stepped forward then, her voice ringing clear. "You tried to silence me with chains. You thought no one would stand. But this town has seen the truth." She turned to the sheriff. "Now do your duty." For a long moment, Dobbs stood frozen. Then, with a slow breath, he drew his revolver not at the warrior, but at Hawley. "Marcus Hawley, you're under arrest for attempted murder." His voice cracked, but he held firm. The townsfolk erupted not in chaos, but in cheers. At last, the spell of fear was broken. Men and women stepped forward, standing beside the lady and the warrior, their courage rising like dawn. The warrior released Hawley and stood tall once more. His chest heaved with breath, blood streaking his shoulder, but his eyes burned steady. He looked at the lady, and for the first time a faint smile touched his lips. "You are free now," he said softly. "Not because I tore chains, but because you spoke truth." The train whistle blew in the distance, a long, mournful cry. The rails hummed beneath their feet, no longer whispering of death, but of new beginnings. And in that moment, as the town of Dry Creek stood united, they all knew what the warrior man had done would never be forgotten.